welcome all those who are visiting us today. It's nice to see the Powers here. I saw them before Mass today. I haven't seen them in a long time. We're blessed by your presence here. God so loved the world that he gave his only Son. Sometimes it seems like Jesus' words get mixed up. Sometimes we preachers can make it sound like God's playing gotcha, rather than this wonderful, flowing gift of grace. You know, years ago, there was a wonderful saint, probably one of the greatest thinkers in the history of Christianity, the East Church or the West Church, St. Augustine. One day, St. Augustine was trying to figure out this idea of Trinity, because it was so central to everything the apostles believed and the early church believed, the patristic period held so tightly. What does this mean? And Augustine, who had a colorful past, was an amazing thinker. One of the most profound, probably the most, Thomas Aquinas perhaps, but he had a wonderful way of thinking and studying the scriptures, philosophy, contemporary thought. One day he was walking along the beach, trying to find the answer, trying to understand what it might mean. 3 persons, one God. And he was walking and walking, beautiful ocean, sun catching it. And all of a sudden he saw a little girl, pretty little girl, probably about 7 years old. And she had this shell. And with this big shell, about this big, she was scooping sand out of the beach. And she created a hole about so deep. And she was taking her shell and going over to the ocean and filling the shell with water and going to the hole she had dug and putting the water in the little hole. Augustine saw her and said, what are you doing, little girl? Why are you doing that? And she said, well, I'm going to take all the water from the ocean and put it in this hole that I dug. Augustine said, oh, you silly little girl. You can't take all of that water, that huge body of water, and put it in that little hole. How can you even believe that you could? And the little girl looked up at Augustine and she said, and you're trying to take the whole mystery of the Trinity and shove it into that little head of yours. How silly you are. And then she disappeared. It was Augustine's come to Jesus moment. The Trinity takes some understanding. There are lots of pretty shells on the beach. This time of year, I usually start getting excited because in 3 or 4 months, I get to go to Cape Cod for a couple of weeks. I take my bike with some friends, and we pedal around. We go to Martha's Vineyard, some beautiful bike trails there, and lots of good food. More and more we eat and less biking, but as I get older. But it's fun one way or the other. There are things on the beach, getting up early in the morning and seeing surprising things. Some of the sea glass that we spoke of, I don't know if it was here I spoke of it, but the pieces of sea glass. And there's shells, there's scallop shells, they're everywhere. And then there'll be shells from things you have no idea what they might be. This last week, as I was trying to figure out what I wanted to say, how I could speak to you today, a couple of things came to my mind, and I'm sharing them today. Hopefully it will make some sense. This week, I think it was Sunday or Monday, it was a kind of a serendipitous thing. I was channel surfing, as guys especially love to do, and I noticed it was Channel 11, the CW, was showing a movie that I saw 25 years ago. The movie was A River Runs Through It. A River Runs Through It. Some of you perhaps remember the movie. It was a story about a Presbyterian minister in Montana and his wife who had two sons, Norman and Paul. And everything was wonderful for them. The minister was very strict, straight-laced, as many the old-fashioned Presbyterians were. He was a great preacher. Spent a lot of time on his sermon. Presbyterians are among the best preachers there are. And they love to fly fish. Anyone here fly fish? Okay, very good. There aren't too many fly fishermen. It's a real trick. And in the movie, if you get a chance, you probably could go to Netflix and be able to access it, and it would be well worth your while. This is a movie that was directed and really, it was written, it's actually the memoir of this Presbyterian minister's son. But Robert Redford was really the one who put it on the screen, created the movie, did a magnificent job. But he showed these boys with their father in the river with the fly fishing, seeing the ark and the fly, and almost whimsical, like a spider. It's hard to describe it. You have to see it. I don't fish well to begin with, and I could never fly fish. But as long as they stayed close to the river, as long as they were close to one another, everything was fine. The one son went away and got his degree and was going to be an English teacher, Norman. But Paulie was a golden boy. He was a beautiful person to look at, and he had a beautiful heart. But he also had an addiction to gambling that really was his fatal flaw. And his family loved him so much, and they tried to help him, each one of them, and it just didn't seem to work. And in the end, he was killed by people he owed money to. I just want to read something from the book. It's actually from the text of the movie. Pastor McLean was saying this at a funeral, but I think he was really thinking of his son. Each one of us here today at this funeral will at one time in our lives look upon a loved one who is in need and ask the same question. We are willing to help, Lord, but what, if anything, is needed? For it is true, we can seldom help those who are closest to us. Either we don't know what part of ourselves to give, or more often than not, the part we have to give is not wanted. And so it is that those we live with and should know often elude us. I love this line, but we can still love them. We can love them completely without complete understanding. It was an interesting thing that came to me. I was so happy. I thought God put that there for me, and you have to sit here and listen to it because you already came in here, so you can't leave yet. The other thing that came to me is I finally finished, as I was looking on this beach of my mind and imagination, I found the shell of my finishing Harper Lee's second novel, Go Set a Watchman. I don't know how many of you are Harper Lee fans. She wrote To Kill a Mockingbird, classic American novel, really. Almost everybody, I won't have you raise your hands because you'll be embarrassed if you didn't, but To Kill a Mockingbird was this wonderful book. She grew up in Macon, Alabama, and it's a true story of kind of based on her life. When she was 7 years old, and her brother Jem, and her father Atticus Finch was this wonderful attorney who was perfect. She comes back when she's 24, and that's where Go Set a Watchman picks up. Go Set a Watchman. She finds it difficult coming home because everything's changed. She goes to a town meeting and finds out that Atticus seems to be cooperating with some racists And she's scandalized. Her father always was the perfect person. And she didn't understand this. She found it very difficult. She had to rediscover a whole new relationship. Thank God for her. She had a real knockdown brawl with her father, Atticus. You need to read the book to understand. At the end, I wasn't going to read it. First of all, I love Harper Lee, and I didn't want to read the last words she would ever write. They're marvelous books, these two. But this one, while not quite as perfect in terms of its craftsmanship, actually, I was in tears at the end of it, reading the words. Because with Harper Lee, I did what my mom used to always make me do, read out loud to hear the music in the words she would say. If it's a good writer, you'll hear music in those words. It could be the sports page, but you will hear music if they know how to write. This is what her uncle told her, because she had just had it with her father. She was so scandalized, and it's complex, and I can't go through all that with you today. You'll have to read it. He says to her, "You were born with your own conscience, but somewhere along the line, you fastened it like a barnacle onto your father's conscience. And as you grew up, when you were grown, totally unknown to yourself, you confused your father with God. You never saw him as a man with a man's heart and a man's failings. I'll grant you, it may have been hard because he makes so few mistakes, but he makes them, like all of us. You were an emotional cripple, leaning on him, getting the answers from him, assuming that your answers would always be his answers." Why do I share these things with you? Because the Trinity comes into our lives, as it did in the McLean family in Montana, as it did in Alabama in the Finch family. When we have to rediscover people, we have to enter again into relationships, sometimes with our fathers, our mothers, our sons, our daughters, our brothers, our sisters, our spouses, who are not the same people we married, who are not the people we knew when we were little kids. That's what Scout had to do when she became Jean Louise, a 24-year-old woman. Each one of us has to realize the Spirit is continuing to work with us every day of our lives. And the Holy Trinity reminds us that that presence is with us always. Last week we celebrated the Pentecost, the coming of the Spirit. And today we remind ourselves again of the presence of Father, Son, and Spirit in all of the folds of our life. I believe in God the Father